yes, having enough liquid or water is necessary to be hydrated, but that doesn't mean that we want to just drink more water, especially plain water that isn't coming from food or other things. I'm actually going to start by talking about what happens when we don't have enough salt, because it makes what happens when we don't have enough water more clear. So the reason why this is important is because salt and water kind of go together, and like salt will kind of attract water with it. And so when we have a certain amount of salt that's circulating in our blood all the time, and that allows us to maintain the right amount of blood or blood volume, and that allows for proper circulation and a well-functioning system. And when we don't get enough salt, it does two things. One, it reduces the concentration of salt in our blood, or sodium in our blood, and will also therefore reduce the blood volume. And that causes a couple of major issues, because it means that there is not enough blood, like there's not enough of this transport system to transport nutrients and waste and things throughout the body. So we have a lot of very intricate mechanisms in place to prevent this from happening, basically, where if we don't have enough salt, we don't just hang around with less salt in our blood. Our body adapts to it, which is part of the whole issue with the sodium and hypertension or high blood pressure recommendations, which the idea being that if you take in more salt, that means you have more salt in your blood. It means you have more water in your blood. That increases blood volume and causes high blood pressure. But in reality, that isn't the case. And the reason is because we adapt. So when we have too little salt, it reduces the blood volume and the sodium concentration in our blood. And we have this entire system in place to fix that. And this is basically within the RAS system, the renin-aldosterone-angiotensin system. And what happens is our kidney is always excreting a certain amount of sodium. And so when we're eating less salt, it starts excreting less sodium and it holds on to sodium. And this helps to increase the blood volume. Another thing that it does is it causes vasoconstriction, which means that it causes the constriction of the blood vessels, which then also helps to raise our blood pressure. So that way, basically, we still have the same circulation that we would have had otherwise. So again, to summarize here, when we have too little salt, it lowers our blood volume. It means we have less circulation, our blood pressure drops, and the amount of salt in our blood drops. And so this renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, the RAS system, is activated, and this causes us to hold on to salt, which helps to prevent the salt in our blood, that concentration, from falling too low. And then the other thing that it does is it causes vasoconstriction to help to bring the blood pressure back up. And this is really helpful, and it's a very helpful adaptive response that needs to happen if we're eating too little salt, but it comes at a cost, and that cost ends up actually causing a lot of issues in the long run. It ends up leading to further dehydration in the long run. It actually ends up leading to higher blood pressure in the long run, which is the whole purpose that people are eating less salt in the first place. And a couple of the reasons for that, those costs, are that when our kidneys are holding on to sodium, they aren't or excreting the same amount of sodium as before. Instead, they replace that sodium with potassium and also magnesium. So when the system is activated, when we have aldosterone, the whole RAS system is activated, it leads to the retention of sodium and the excretion of potassium and magnesium. And because magnesium and potassium are really important for keeping ourselves hydrated and relaxed, when we, over time, have lesser amounts of potassium and magnesium, it leads to further vasoconstriction and contraction and dehydration, or swelling, which are kind of the same situation because the water's not usable. And that ends up actually contributing to high blood pressure and increased sympathetic activity in the long run. So that's kind of one of those main effects. And then there are some other effects outside of the loss of potassium and magnesium. And one of them is just the direct effect, like the direct stress effect of the activation of these systems. So you have the RAS system activated. You also have some norepinephrine that'll be released when we're having too little salt. And it's a pretty significant amount too. And these will basically put us under stress, but they also directly cause dehydration and contraction within the cellular structure. So, which it's kind of the same as any other stress or inflammatory pathway, where in the short term it works out and it's helpful, but in the long term it ends up causing all of these all these problems, basically the opposite of all the things we're trying to solve by lowering salt intake or having enough
Yeah.
water.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note here that this doesn't, what we'll get to essentially what you want to do is it's not that you want to have an excessive amount of salt, because ratio and amount relative to other things are important. But at the same time, severely restricting salt, and unless you have a significant, like you have a serious medical condition that specifically needs salt restriction, like like severe forms of kidney disease, or if you have issues like brain injuries that or endocrine issues with syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, or Addison's disease, things like that. I don't think it's Addison's. Uh,
I think
it's not Addison's. It's diabetes insipidus. Addison's is
isn't
adrenal
that
deficiency.
right? So I was
Yeah.
going to say salt's actually helpful for Addison's.
Yeah, salt is helpful, exactly. So diabetes insipidus or syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, then playing with salt and things like that are a little more dangerous. But for your average person being healthy, salting the taste is, I mean, eventually, it's pretty much what you want to do here. What you crave, and overloading salt. I mean, there are some things that are helpful with athletes and things like that, but I mean, these are different scopes. I just want to clarify where the context of what we're talking about is, and the importance of salting the taste and things like that. And then to further clarify some of the things that you said, when you don't have enough salt, then your body tries to retain salt. And to retain salt, it uses the RAS system, and specifically aldosterone. And aldosterone at the kidney causes the retention, at the kidney specifically, causes the retention of sodium, but in doing so causes the wasting of magnesium and potassium. And so over time, since magnesium and potassium are the main intracellular electrolytes, if you continue to waste magnesium and potassium over time, there is a possibility that you can get cellular dehydration because you don't have electrolytes, those main electrolytes in the cell to maintain the proper hydration status of the cell. So having adequate electrolytes of sodium, potassium, and magnesium, all three of them, is actually extremely important. And restricting any of them, unless you have a severe problem, is because the other thing is it's not just about intake. There's different things that can affect potassium and things like that. So in different diabetic states, or if you have a lot of cell damage, then you can have a lot of potassium leak into the bloodstream. And some of these things, like in cancer or chemotherapy regimens, and some of these things can have detrimental effects, or so there's other things that can affect it. But for generally healthy people, what you're looking at is it's important to make sure that you're having a combination of all the electrolytes and having a deficit of sodium in this case specifically. And the reason we're talking about sodium in relation to drinking is because when you have an excess amount of water in the bloodstream, it dilutes the amount of salt that you have. And so it will cause you to basically unload the excess water and try to retain the sodium that you have. And so you can cause some wasting in that sense as well. So that's why the salt and the water sort of move together. And anytime you learn in physiology about the different electrolyte systems or fluid systems, you learn that salt and water sort of go together. So where salt goes, water goes, and things like that. And diluting, and water can dilute salt, and then you have different effects from there. So basically, yeah, you want to make sure that you're having adequate amounts of salt, not an excessive amount of salt.
Yeah, and just to go back real quickly to what you were talking about with the intracellular versus extracellular electrolytes, when sodium and calcium are entering the cell, that's what leads to what's typically considered excitation. But that's also basically the process that occurs in cell death and dehydration and a lack of energy when it's occurring in excessive amounts. And so that's kind of what you're getting at, which is why potassium and magnesium are so important, and why we don't want to be excreting them in place of sodium. And this is why I started with what happens with low salt intake, is because when we have a lot of water, then that basically mimics the equivalent of having too little salt. And all of the same things apply. It causes that same stress response that leads to the same loss of potassium and magnesium. It leads to the same eventual cell swelling and inhibition of cellular energy production and dehydration, which is the whole thing that you're trying to fix in the first place. And the effect of this response is it's pretty noteworthy. So when people talk about the fact that water increases our metabolism, and they've shown that in research that it causes energy expenditure, and that's true. But the way that it does this is through this stress system. So what basically happens is our body senses that we've reduced our salt concentration, and it activates these stress systems. It includes the RAS system, but there's also adrenergic effects and increase in sympathetic activity. And that has been shown to be responsible for that increase in energy expenditure. That supposed increase in metabolism is basically just stress. And they've shown in the research as well that when you drink water that has the same amount of salt as our blood, basically the same concentration, and it's osmotically balanced, you don't have that same effect. You don't have the same stress, and you don't have the same increase in energy expenditure, which basically, like, the dilution of the salt is what leads to the energy expenditure, and the stress is what leads to the energy expenditure. So it's not actually a good thing, even though it's supposed to be, even though that's why one of the reasons that we're told to drink a lot of water is that it increases our metabolism. But in reality, it's just putting stress, and it's just putting stress on our system, which is not helpful.
Yeah. Another thing that I think people should know is that and this is directly what they do in the hospital. If you are going to transfuse somebody any type of fluid, and they're healthy, they're just dehydrated, you actually give fluid with salt, and they call it normal saline. So there's a certain concentration of salt within the water. It's 0.9%. And then in different disease states, say you have too much sodium in the blood or anything like that, you actually give a hypotonic solution, or you have a lot of fluid in the tissues. Your tissues have a lot of fluid. Then you give a hypertonic solution so that the solute in there can pull the fluid out of the tissues. So they know, in medicine, they know that certain concentrations of electrolytes are important to function.
Yeah,
so,
I want to explain. I mean, that's a really good point. I just want to translate that for people who don't know what hypertonic means and all that. But basically, you're saying that when somebody's swollen and edematous, meaning they've got a lot of excess water in the wrong places, you're saying that they actually give people solutions with extra salt, like beyond what they would normally give a saline solution, to reduce the edema.
So in different situations, so if you have trauma and things like that, they actually give different solutions that contain, sometimes they'll give albumin as well if they have really low intravascular fluids and they're going into a lot of third space, because albumin has a very strong osmotic effect in terms of keeping water in the intravascular space. But there's different things like osmolyte or I think it's plasmolyte, things like that, which are high. They're high in electrolytes and things like that to pull the fluid out of the tissues and put it back in the intravascular space.
Yeah, and yet we're told to just drink all of this plain water. And we'll talk about this a little later too, but we're not against having liquid in our diet. It's just much better if it's packaged with some of these electrolytes that we need, and enough sodium and some things that might be helpful for supporting energy production. It's almost the equivalent, people will talk about white sugar being so detrimental because of a lack of nutrients.
Yeah.
Exactly. And plain water is basically the same thing. And in the same way that you need those vitamins and minerals for us to use sugar properly, we need vitamins and minerals and energy in order to properly use water.